Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. ICE is rounding up undocumented workers at processing plants in Mississippi. Children are being separated from their families because of enforcement of a nearly 100-year-old criminal law regarding crossing the border. And now there are more and more people calling for actually decriminalizing border crossings. Immigration has never before been as much in the news as it is, and never as complicated and confusing and so much misinformation. And that's why on today's episode, I've invited Bill Hing, a professor of immigration law at the University of San Francisco Law School in San Francisco, one of the country's leading authorities on deportation, on immigration generally, and also somebody who was among a small number of people who was asked by a federal court to inspect just recently, earlier this summer, one of the facilities where children are being detained, having been separated from their parents. So Bill is going to help us through all of these issues and help us understand what's really going on, how things were being done during President Obama's time, and how President Trump has changed the nature of immigration enforcement. You decide what you think after listening to this really important episode. Stay tuned. On the day that we're recording this episode, ICE, police, and Department of Homeland Security police are rounding up allegedly undocumented workers at a number of processing facilities in Mississippi and separating parents from their children in the process. Last week, the Democrats held 2 nights of a second round of debates, and there were a number of ideas posed regarding how to address the issue of immigration in this country, one of which was to decriminalize, or so-called decriminalize, illegal or improper border crossings. So once again, immigration is very much in the news, but most media outlets are not getting much beneath the headlines of these very important issues. And we're going to try to address that problem today with my guest, Bill Hing, a professor of law and one of the country's leading authorities on deportation and other related issues affecting our border. Bill, thank you so much for being on the program. It's a great pleasure to have you.
Happy to be here.
In addition, Bill, I should note right off the bat that you teach at the University of San Francisco Law School in San Francisco, where my sister is the dean of the law school. But to be very clear, I didn't come to you through her. I was looking for somebody to help us understand these enormously complex issues, and I independently came upon you as indeed an expert on this subject. And then I saw where you taught, and I thought, oh, well, even better. So I wanted to put that disclaimer out there. But you have written extensively, taught extensively on this topic. Your latest book, American Presidents, Deportation and Human Rights Violation, has been published by Cambridge University Press. You run the Immigration and Deportation Defense Clinic as its director, and you've been involved in these issues very deeply and passionately for a number of years. I'm sure I've left out a good bit of your background, but do you want to add anything about your background before we jump into these topics?
No, let's just jump right into it. Thanks for the kind introduction.
You're very welcome. Maybe we need to, here are the topics I want to really address today. I want to address the issue of family separation at the border. I don't think anything has captured the attention of so many Americans more than that aspect of this debate. And then I want to take on 2 issues that were discussed at the Democratic debates last week in Detroit. One, the criticism, some some might even say surprising, of former President Obama, who I think is fairly widely known to have been responsible for more deportations than any president before him. And I want to really try to understand that issue better.
Sure.
And finally, this question of decriminalizing what federal law currently characterizes as improper crossings, and how that is contributing, or how the criminalization of improper crossings at our southern border is contributing to this whole wrenching issue of family separation. So that's kind of my agenda today. And I thought perhaps we could start with the issue that is burning up the headlines today as we record. This episode will air in a few days' time, but today in Mississippi, ICE and DHS officials are rounding up close to 700 undocumented immigrants and separating them from their children. I know that you have visited the border and visited one of these detention facilities where children have been detained, separated from their parents, and you've seen firsthand and up close the conditions there. So I wonder if we could start there and give us some background on that issue, what you've seen and what you think of that.
Sure. First of all, the facilities that I went to in the middle of June was run by the Border Patrol in Clint, Texas, which is just right outside of El Paso. And that's in contrast with facilities that are run by ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and then other facilities that are run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is run by the Department of Health and Human Services. The Border Patrol is, by law, not supposed to detain children for more than 72 hours. There's a bill that President Bush signed in 2008, a trafficking victims bill that contains that language, that children are not supposed to be detained for more than 72 hours by Border Patrol. They're supposed to be turned over to Health and Human Services, Office of Refugee Resettlement. And the litigators in a case called Flores, that's a case that's been pending for more than 20 years. That case controls the conditions under which children are detained. The federal judge in that case regularly orders inspections of facilities where there may be evidence that violations of conditions are being committed. And there was evidence that the Flores attorneys who represent the class of children had heard that the Border Patrol was violating the 72-hour rule, and the judge ordered access to that facility, and there were 8 of us that were selected to go on that inspection. I actually have inspected family detention centers before, but never one that was solely committed to children. And what we found was shocking. We interviewed over 60 children. The team of us, I myself interviewed close to 20 of them over a period of 3 days. And first of all, most of the children were there for 2 to 3 weeks rather than 72 hours. They were held in rooms, not cages. The cages existed at other facilities that had been inspected by a different team. Ours were detained in rooms and areas that held from 20 to 50 people of the same gender. Cramped conditions. Not everyone had a bed. Some had mats to sleep on. And you're right. All of them had been separated from a family member. Some separated from parents. Most, at this point, were separated from an aunt or uncle or older cousin that had brought them. And the conditions were awful. The youngest child that I interviewed that was separated from an uncle was 4 years old. But that wasn't the youngest that one of my team members interviewed, believe it or not. And I know people find this hard to believe. One of the children that was separated from an aunt was 2 years old. That 2-year-old child was expected to take care of herself. And the Border Patrol cannot, they're not nurses, they're not child care people. They say that up front. And the person that took that 2-year-old under her wing was another 16-year-old who just happened to be in the same room, and out of the kindness of her heart started taking care of the 2-year-old. And I might add, she also started taking care of a 6-year-old.
In other words, another child who was detained in the same room.
Exactly.
Not a professional, obviously, and not an older sibling of that.
In fact, a complete stranger.
Yeah.
Who did this. And,
wow.
So that was, of course, awful. And there were bathing facilities available, but the youngest kids were the most dirty that I encountered. Why? Because they were expected to bathe themselves in front of others, and they just wouldn't do it. And there were washing machines, but they didn't wash their clothes. So the older kids, the 16, 17-year-olds, they were the cleanest. The dirtiest were the young ones. And it's just an experience that, honestly, I can't get out of my mind because of what I saw and witnessed.
Well, and so you've brought out a couple of concepts related to this whole issue. This requirement that children not be detained by Border Control officials for longer than 72 hours. Is that a requirement that comes out of the Flores case that you mentioned?
No, the Flores case says that they must release the children from any custody within 20 days, within 21 days.
Okay.
They must be detained. They must be released from any facility. The language of 72 hours comes from a trafficking victims law that was signed in 2008.
By President Bush.
That's the 72-hour
provision,
where Border Patrol can't hold them, but then they can turn them over to Office of Refugee Resettlement.
So one problem, of course, is the issue that the children are being separated in the first place, and we have to understand why that's happening. But beyond that, there's this whole issue of the conditions, which are deplorable, which are, it's hard to imagine there is a human being alive who wouldn't be deeply disturbed by the kinds of things that you saw firsthand. And they're being held longer than they should be held, which is still another problem. So can perhaps we take a step back, because I think a lot of people have a lot of misinformation and a lot of misunderstanding about this issue. You've mentioned this Flores case and that it's a class action that's been ongoing for 2 decades. So what if anything is new about this problem? And then I think we have to obviously get into questions of what can be done to address the problem. But what is new about this, or is it exaggerated that this is something new?
No, the newest thing about it is the numbers. So Flores actually began more than 30 years ago when the plaintiffs argued that the old Immigration Service should not even be detaining children. That question actually went to the Supreme Court in a case called Flores v. Reno that was decided in the 1980s. And in that decision, the Supreme Court said, well, this is a hard question, but in fact, we do think the Immigration Service can detain children, migrant children. The question of conditions, however, we're going to send back to the trial court to determine under what conditions. That got sent back to the trial court, and after many years, a settlement was reached between the plaintiff's attorneys and the government. And now, and people can very easily look for this online, the Flores settlement agreement lays out all the different conditions, and they are are such things that they're not supposed to be detained actually they're supposed to be detained in the least restrictive setting possible, that they're supposed to be assured of safety and sanitation, that there must be exercise space available, that there must be education provided if the kids are detained more than a few days, that there has to be a licensed children's facility. So that's what's in the Flores settlement agreement. And at the time, there were not thousands and thousands of children being detained. There were hundreds, and over the years, and that's pretty much how it played out. There were violations that the court cited from time to time in terms of cleanliness, health care, that type of thing. But the numbers actually didn't get sizable until, interestingly enough, the Obama administration. So the Obama administration, in 2014, there was a surge of unaccompanied children and also many women and children fleeing from Central America. The violence, the gang and cartel violence had increased around that time, and in 2014, 2015, well over 100,000 individuals fled from Central America each year in those years, and similar numbers today. So when those numbers exploded, the Obama administration, for many years, had been President Obama tried to deliver comprehensive immigration reform, and he has admitted then and now that he basically was very strict on immigration in terms of deportations. And I know that's something you may want to expand upon later, but he felt that he needed to show that he could enforce immigration laws if he wanted to get the Republicans to the table to discuss comprehensive immigration reform. He was very highly criticized for this influx in 2014, 2015, for attracting them. That was the allegation, that he was attracting these folks from Central America because he had been so generous to dreamers by, in 2012, issuing what people know as the DACA order, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals order, that allows children undocumented who grew up in the United States to work and live here without fear of deportation. And so he reacted. The way he reacted was he ended what George Bush and he had been doing. It's a pejorative phrase now, but he ended what has been called catch and release. Up until that time, they basically would process people who they encountered at the border, and they would send them on their way. They would say, okay, we know where you're headed. You've given us the address of your cousin that you're going to live with in Milwaukee, and here's a notice of appearance that you must appear at before an immigration judge in the town that you're headed to on such and such a date. And they would just be on their way, and there was a 98% appearance rate. There was not an absconsion problem.
That is completely contrary to what I know. Certainly, I've read in news accounts on that.
Exactly.
Which is that once people were let in or were caught and released, basically they disappeared and never appeared. I mean, that is
not true, and that my data is confirmed by the Transaction Resource Action Center at Syracuse University that relies on government information for that information. So.
Let me.
The lowest appearance rate recorded several years ago was 80%.
It's still very high.
up to over the 90s.
Yeah.
So, at any rate, Obama opened these family detention centers, the biggest ones in Dilley, Texas, and Karnes, Texas, and I've inspected the one in Dilley, Texas, and they took a very bad position. In my opinion, the position that the Trump administration has repeated, they are argued, the Obama administration argued that since the children in Dilley were being held with a parent, not on their own, that the Flores case should not apply to them. But the court, both the federal district court in Los Angeles that oversees the Flores case and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, both said no. Flores applies to any child that's in detention, even if they're with a parent. And so that's the big difference is the numbers. The Obama administration began holding thousands of children in these family detention centers. The big difference with the Trump administration is that they're holding not just children with their parents in detention, but they're holding children alone in these detention centers for more than 72 hours. And so it may not seem to be different, but those are the primary differences over the years.
I don't know that
administration.
That sounds like a huge difference to me. I mean, there's a huge difference between a child being with a parent or parents or even an aunt or an uncle and being in a completely separate room or facility with other children. I mean, I don't see how that can't be seen as something wildly different from before. So, but let me make sure I understand what some of what you've said. So, to understand what was going on during the second Obama term, first of all, you've described what sound like demographic changes in the migrants coming to the border. That there's more coming from Central America and more women and children, as opposed to what previously it was primarily from Mexico and primarily men coming to the border looking for work. Is that an accurate?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And so, as many listeners probably know, the concern over so-called undocumented immigration along the border has long been focused on Mexican migration, undocumented Mexican migration. And again, if you look at a place like the Pew Hispanic Center that keeps track of all different types of numbers, including border processing and undocumented migration in the United States, contrary to popular belief, the number of undocumented immigrants from Mexico is at an all-time low. It reached zero in terms of numbers that were leaving and numbers that were coming. So there really are not that significant number of undocumented Mexicans, and they were primarily men. And then at various times, of course, there were family members trying to rejoin a parent that was already here. But the story of the last few years, you're exactly right. It's Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, the so-called Northern Triangle, that has led to people fleeing because of the type of violence I alluded to earlier: cartel, narcotics, gang, and also I should add that there's domestic violence victims that are fleeing as well. And by that I mean a lot of women that are fleeing a macho culture. There are cases that talk about whether or not that type of flight should enable someone to apply for political asylum. But a lot of the women that we have a clinic, as you said at the outset, at University of San Francisco. A lot of the women that we represent, they fled that type of domestic violence because the police couldn't protect them from their spouses.
Well, and I'm a little confused, Bill, about the numbers, because I think you said that during the late in the Obama presidency, the numbers from Central America were something on the order of 100,000 a year. But at least the reports in the news say that there are as many as 100,000 a month. So given what you've said about the decline in migrants from Mexico, is
Right.
Have the numbers from Central America really exploded to that extent? That going from
We have to
100,000 a year
see
to
what the final
100,000 a month?
numbers are going to be for 2019.
Mm-hmm.
2019 may be the highest. I saw those numbers as well. I'm a little bit skeptical of those numbers, but certainly I agree that there are large numbers that are coming today. My hunch, and I've been, just in the last few months, I've been to Tijuana to work with people, students and other attorneys, and I went to Tijuana at the end of February to meet with caravan members who were preparing to come across. So there were huge numbers, and then I went to Honduras in March to also talk to folks that were contemplating leaving Honduras because of the violence. And there definitely are large numbers, but my hunch is that we may see this year, if anything, 150,000, because there's already been a decline just in the last few weeks since those reports that were record-setting numbers that were being apprehended at the border.
Okay, so and the deal or the approach, I guess, that you described President Obama taking was to essentially come across and in fact be very tough on so-called border security, preventing new illegal or improper crossings,
right,
as a way of wooing Republicans to the table to try to deal more comprehensively with the millions of undocumented individuals already in the country. Is that right?
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And he used similar rhetoric that President Trump is using, that we are detaining folks and we are being stricter at the border. This is Obama, because we want to send a message of deterrence, and that's among the many pieces of rhetoric that President Trump is using, especially that this is a security problem. He's also using the deterrence rhetoric, and I might add that President Clinton constructed something called Operation Gatekeeper in the 1990s, where he militarized some of the most easy parts of the border to cross. And he also said this is about, we're doing this to deter. The problem is, especially with Obama and Trump, is that message of deterrence implies that folks are not being driven by something that is stronger than any kind of deterrence you might put up at the border, and it ignores the violence, the root causes. And President Obama and Vice President Biden, they actually did spend some money on looking at the root causes in those three countries, but that kind of funding was small compared to border funding. And then the Trump administration has withdrawn all that type of root cause investment in those three countries.
Well, and then there's another program that, as I understand it, has contributed to the number of illegal crossings, despite the tough talk rhetoric that both Democratic and Republican presidents have been using, and that's metering, where you limit the number of asylum seekers who can cross at a recognized port of entry, leaving them to wait in Mexico in God knows what conditions, so that then becomes kind of a reverse incentive for people to find a different way over the border.
Exactly. Two different things that come together there. And again, I witnessed that firsthand in Tijuana in February when the metering or waitlist system started. So every day, the Border Patrol has a deal with Mexican officials. The Mexican officials entity is called Grupos Beta. And the deal is we will tell you how many people can come to the port of entry each day. So we advise you to maintain a wait list, and we'll tell you how many people we're going to take off the wait list each day. And so everybody's got a number each number is assigned to 10 people, the groups of 10, and so the footnote here that needs to be added is that the vast majority of those folks gathered at the border are trying to present themselves lawfully. They're not trying to enter without inspection. They're coming to present themselves to apply for asylum. And that's what we advise them also. Don't try to cross illegally. Go to the port of entry. And that's what they're doing. But the problem is some days they take 10 people, some days they take 20 people. But there are thousands gathered at the border. And as you recall, that horrible picture, I think it was last month, of the man, the 20-year-old man with his 2 or 3-year-old daughter who died trying to cross the river in Texas. He was on that wait list, but he grew impatient after many weeks and tried to just come across. And that's on top of another thing that the Trump administration has implemented, and it's called the Remain in Mexico policy. So even people who get to the border and get to present themselves off the wait list, there's now about 15,000 of those individuals. That is mostly men, but also some women, that have been told to go back and wait in Mexico, even though we've taken you off the wait list. And these are dangerous cities. Tijuana and Flores, which is on the other side of the El Paso border, are world-renowned, dangerous places, extreme violence. And so we were told by many people we would rather be in ICE detention in the United States than sleep in a shelter in Tijuana where we don't feel safe at all. And that's what it's come to.
Okay, so what? Let's make sure we're very clear then. A lot of the policies that we're talking about today, and that people who don't like Trump are pointing at him as the cause of, it sounds like a lot of these policies have been put into motion over a much longer period than the last few years, right? Is that fair to say?
I think it's definitely fair to say that border enforcement, rhetoric of deterrence, militarizing the border, all started long before Donald Trump. In 2006, the Senate passed. The Congress passed the Fence Act in 2006 that would have added, I think it was about 800 miles of fencing along the border, and two very well-known Democratic senators voted for that bill in 2006, and they are Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. And so that, you're right, it was all set in motion. Donald Trump has taken it to the nth degree, however.
Yeah. Well, so tell us about that, because this is important to understand.
Kinds of things, for example, that you've got to remain in Mexico, that never was implemented by anyone. I mean, to have to wait in a place that's very dangerous. If you pass the screening to apply for asylum, at least you've got to be in the United States and usually not in custody to apply for asylum. Trump has also enlisted Guatemala to be a place that will handle asylum applications from El Salvador and Honduras. So that was an agreement that was signed 2 weeks ago. They strong-armed Guatemala so that now the Trump administration is saying, we're not going to take any applications from Honduras or El Salvador unless, if you pass through Guatemala, you've got to apply in Guatemala first, which is of course insane, because Guatemala's level of violence ranks in the top 5 in the world. Then he also has this policy where if you try to enter the United States without inspection, then you're not even eligible for asylum. what else? Then he also has a policy where if you have been, and it leads to the introduction that if you entering without inspection, even if you have a kid with you, we're going to criminally prosecute you under a zero tolerance policy.
Right. Well, that seems to be one of the most dramatic changes under this president.
That was a policy choice by Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Other presidents did not as heavily prosecute the simple entry without inspection, which is a misdemeanor. And that, of course, as you cited at the outset, that's led to Julian Castro's proposal to decriminalize that action.
Right, and I'm going to turn to that in just a second, because I think that's a perfect segue. But just to be clear, children prior to the Trump presidency, children were detained at the border. It's just that when they were detained by in facilities where they could remain with their parents. They weren't separate. And I want to make sure I'm saying that accurately.
Right.
Is that right? Children could be detained, were detained, and increasing numbers under Obama, but they weren't separated into distinct places. Yeah.
Right. But if they did come by themselves, if they were unaccompanied, and there were many 13, 14, 15-year-olds that came by themselves, then they did go into Office of Refugee Resettlement Facilities, which are much better than, some of them are not great either, but they're much better than being in a Border Patrol facility.
And part of the problem, given the numbers and the change in the demographics of the people who are coming, a lot of people are talking, and it seems like a lot more people are yelling, on one end of this issue or another. But I mean, there does need to be more money for this, doesn't there? I mean, we had on the program a number of months ago a former immigration judge who was expressed as much passion and concern for the problem as you are, but his perspective was, we need money. We need money to process people and keep them safe and keep conditions humane. And there's no money. The Congress has not appropriated money for this.
Yeah, I have a slightly different view. I wouldn't say completely different view, but a slightly different view. And here goes. I think that if we throw money at ICE or the Border Patrol to open facilities up, to open more facilities up, then we're giving them more license to just detain. Now, and this is something that Nancy Pelosi has been criticized, and she's my member of Congress since then.
That's right.
My representative, and I look at it differently. I really thought that they should have at least enabled that when they passed that package a month or so ago. They should have passed it with conditions that this money is to be used for certain types of facilities that are clean and safe and have health care assured and that kind of thing. And none of those conditions were attached. She went along with Mitch McConnell on that. The other thing that immigration judges are arguing that they are backlogged and that they need to have more of them. And listen. I admit I'm a I'm a deportation defense attorney, and I'm not in the business of trying to speed up the deportation of my clients. And time heals a lot of things, and this is what I mean. That it takes time for us often to develop our cases. It takes time to find representation for people. And even a metropolitan area like New York or Chicago or San Francisco, where there are large firms that have pro bono attorneys and there are legal aid offices, we can't handle those backlogs either. And so unless they gave us more money, which they have never given us any money to represent folks, what they would do is they would end up speeding up deportation hearings for unrepresented people. And so that's what my objection. I wouldn't just throw money to expand the immigration courts, because due process would be very seriously harmed by just speeding things up.
Bill, to me that seems like such a huge point, and it will lead us into the issue of decriminalizing and how that is how criminalizing border crossings in a way that we haven't seen before this administration, the Trump administration, has added to, notwithstanding the rhetoric that we're trying to deter people from coming. More and more people are coming anyway, and more problems are resulting. But the rhetoric is that we are a nation of laws, and if we have a law, that it's unlawful to cross the border, well, we have to enforce that law because we're a nation of laws. But what you're pointing out is that if we're going to be a nation of laws, and I'm now zooming up to 30,000 feet above the whole issue here,
right.
I know, but if we're going to be a nation of laws, we can't pick and choose which laws we're going to deem important. And the rights of individuals, even those who are, and maybe especially those who are coming to this country in such a vulnerable state, can't be ignored.
Right. So here's the way I look at it: that if you just closed or turned a blind eye to why the person entered without inspection, and you just processed based on the fact that the person entered without inspection, then I think that's a problem, because then you would be criminally prosecuting somebody who might have really legitimately was so desperate that they came because of persecution by a gang or even by their government. Then that doesn't make any sense. And that's why I like the argument that Julian Castro makes, is that there's already a violation, a civil violation of deportation. So you can be deported under the civil law if you entered without inspection. And what I like about that is that, and what he is not saying, and what I would advise him if I was an advisor to add, is that in the deportation hearing, then you get to argue about why you came, what were the root causes, meaning then you get to apply for asylum, and the immigration judge at that point makes a decision that we're going to forgive you, if the facts are there, we're going to forgive you for the illegal entry because you're actually eligible for asylum, and we understand why you came illegally. Whereas a criminal court judge doesn't have that discretion. A criminal court judge cannot grant asylum. The criminal court judge just looks at the facts, if the person entered without inspection or not. That's a violation of law. There's no facts that ameliorate the crime for that criminal court judge, and so that's why I like that idea. The other thing I might add is that about half, we can look this up pretty easily, about half of the undocumented population in the United States did not enter without inspection. About half actually are overstayed visitors and students, etc. They came on visas and they overstayed, but that's not a criminal act. And so maybe that means that we should make that a criminal act. But
some might say so. I don't think you would be one of those people.
I wouldn't, but my point is that
right.
You're just picking on those that are from an adjacent country.
Well, so now we have to really get into this and understand, because I think most people do understand that there are civil laws and there are criminal laws, but we have to break that down to understand how they're different in this context, and how those differences have been used differently under President Trump and have led to what we're seeing today in these family separations, perhaps most compellingly. So there is a law. And this is what Julian Castro, the Democrat from Texas who's running for president, was on the debate stage last week challenging the other Democratic candidates on when the subject of immigration came up. The federal statute he's talking about has been part of U.S. law since the 1920s. Is that right?
Probably, yeah, at least.
So, and you've used this phrase, people who have presented without inspection or presented with inspection. And that's actually language that comes from that federal statute. So help us understand what this criminal law on the books since the 1920s, I think it was passed in 1929, actually. What is that crime, and how is that being used under President Trump differently than it had ever been used before, if indeed that's accurate?
So the crime is either entering or attempting to enter surreptitiously at the border without inspection. Okay, and that's a misdemeanor. And in the past, very seldom was it charged. It just was not worth it to U.S. attorneys, especially along the border in San Diego and Tucson and El Paso, etc. It just wasn't worth their time to criminally prosecute them. So they exercised prosecutorial discretion to not bring those charges. However, if somebody had been deported and then they tried to enter without inspection, that rises to the level of a felony, and that was often prosecuted. So in prior administrations, they waited for people who were previous violators to then prosecute them, and that comes with a much more severe criminal sentence of it's a minimum of 2 and often 5 years for the felony. Now, that's also an important question today, given who is gathered at the border and what I said earlier, that folks are actually attempting to present themselves at the port of entry. Well, this is another difference. The Trump administration is taking those folks who are presenting themselves at the port of entry, but without documents, and also criminally prosecuting them for the misdemeanor, even though they are not trying to enter without inspection. And so that has been argued successfully in a handful of cases along the border, that in fact the facts don't meet the crime, the elements of the crime. But the Trump administration has mostly been successful when they examine many of the individuals. They admit that they don't have any documents. They admit that they're trying to come to the United States no matter what to apply for asylum. And some federal court judges have held that that's enough to have the intent to enter without inspection. And so that's a controversial.
Yeah.
That's a controversial matter.
Well, and that's a really important distinction too, because and I think people may not automatically appreciate this distinction, but someone presenting to the border, any of our borders, seeking asylum is actually seeking legal admission to the country.
Exactly.
They're not trying to come into the country illegally. And then there is a procedure under the civil law in our country where if they are already in the country, having come across illegally, or if they are in the country seeking asylum and asylum is denied, under the civil law they could be deported.
Absolutely, and that's those are the folks that were rounded up in Mississippi yesterday. Although I don't know the facts of all 600 of those individuals, but my understanding was that they had information that some had already been ordered deported in absentia, incidentally, because many people don't show up at their hearings, often because they don't have notice. And that's relevant to one of the statistics that we cited at the beginning, is that a study done by the National Immigration Law Center showed that the vast majority of the people that were ordered in absentia, deported in absentia, actually had not received proper notice of their hearing. So that's a large number of those people that got arrested yesterday. People that apparently didn't show up at their hearing, but we need to find out why they didn't show up at their hearing, because immigrant rights attorneys across the country have prepared these motions to reopen. The raids that have been looming for several weeks now that the Trump administration has been threatening has compelled immigrant rights attorneys to not just do know your rights trainings to people to remain silent, etc., but immigrant rights attorneys are preparing to file these motions to reopen because we're pretty confident that many of the folks ordered deported were not ordered deported properly.
Okay, so to come back to President Trump, he takes this almost 100-year-old statute. It's, for any law geeks out there, it's Section 1325 of Title 8 of the U.S. Code.
Right.
And he takes this nearly 100-year-old federal criminal statute that has largely been unenforced. I mean, not just in this context. Most U.S. attorneys, most federal prosecutors don't bother with misdemeanor prosecutions. They've got their hands full prosecuting much more serious and much more violent type of crimes in their district. So that's not surprising. But President Trump, along with his then Attorney General Sessions, comes up with a policy to start enforcing that criminal law. And what is the connection then between that decision, that policy decision, and the increase in children being separated from their parents, this whole family separation issue?
Great question. Because of the zero tolerance policy that Sessions and Trump announced, I guess it's been more than a year ago now, their argument went as follows. Since this father or mother violated 1325 of the Act, we can arrest them and criminally prosecute them for that misdemeanor. And since we are arresting them for criminal violation and holding them in criminal facilities, we certainly cannot take their children with them to the criminal facility. Therefore, we have to separate the children and put them in immigration detention, which is technically a civil detention facility. And so that was the excuse they were giving. And there were several flaws. Not only is that, in my opinion, inhumane, but there were several flaws factually with that. First of all, you don't actually have to take somebody into criminal detention to criminally prosecute them. You can prosecute me staying in my home, and I still have to show up for the criminal case. And so there was no reason why they couldn't hold them together in immigration detention, and then when that parent's court date was due, then bring the parent over there to the federal criminal courthouse. So that was one flaw. The other flaw was that they actually were not actually sentencing them to additional time. They were being given credit for the time that they were in ICE detention. So they only wanted to get the conviction on their record. So the separation was actually minimal. Not separation, the detention, the criminal detention was actually a minimal amount of time. And so that was crazy. And the other thing was that, as it turns out, Judge Zabra from the federal district court that's in San Diego, in the trial before that judge over this issue, he found that the government failed to keep track from the very beginning of where the parent was being detained and where the child was being detained. And as your listeners may recall, it was revealed that the government was unable to reunite many hundreds, if not thousands, of those separated families because they didn't know who was where. It was, and it very, very much upset Judge Sabra when he discovered that.
Well, and to add into the set of problems created by this decision to separate families, which you're saying is completely unnecessary, even if you accept that they're going to enforce this
Right.
This ancient criminal statute. Namely, we have this thing called the Constitution, and it's my understanding that when these cases are being heard, people who have been charged with the crime of improperly crossing the border, they're being presented in court en masse, sometimes as many as 70 or 80 or even 90 people at a time,
right,
without representation, which is required under the Constitution, in effect having been held without bail, without the, it just seems like there's, in addition to the very clear human rights concerns about the conditions in these facilities, there are some constitutional rights concerns in
right.
terms of how we treat people, even people who are alleged to have committed the crime of improperly crossing the border, under long established fundamental principles of rights of the criminally accused.
Right. What you're describing has been named Operation Streamline, and honestly, any member of the public can walk into these courthouses in Tucson, San Diego, and El Paso and watch Operation Streamline. What you just described is completely accurate. They're in large groups. They're brought in often in orange jumpsuits, handcuffed, and it is a criminal case. They do have a right to counsel at government expense. But what isn't often on the record is that they've been told by Border Patrol and ICE officials, listen, you should just go in there and plead guilty if you ever want to see your kids again. Otherwise, if you ask for an attorney and you make a big deal out of this, then you're liable to delay the reunification with your child. Outright lies. And that was verified by many people who had been deported. Some of the parents had been deported and found back in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And so the absolute violation, as you say, of the Constitution, occurred right under the noses of some of the judges. And I might add, some of the judges were not that conscientious in asking what the individuals have been told.
All right, so Julian Castro and others, in calling for essentially repealing this almost 100-year-old statute and taking this criminal law off the books, to be clear, I mean, critics of it have said, "Oh, well, you want to put open borders. You just want to encourage people not only from Central America but from other parts of the world where people may be, living in a violent society, dealing with crime, dealing with political oppression. You just want to open the floodgates and let everybody in." I mean, that's not what I'm hearing you explain is involved here, because we do still have a deportation system, a civil system to deal with.
Right, and these individuals may very well end up in ICE detention anyway, especially the adults. They may not be criminally prosecuted, and as I said, there's not that much in terms of punishment. But they're going to be, if that law did not exist, they'd be arrested anyway. They'd be in detention anyway, and then they would be presented before an immigration judge. And if they don't have any claim to asylum, then they're going to be deported right away. And so there's really not that much to be gained by the misdemeanor conviction. Now, I should say that if a person with a misdemeanor attempts to return, then that also increases the punishment, the crime to a felony. So if that's what this is all about, well, it's a pretty harsh way of getting there.
Well, what do you say then? What would you, Bill, say to people who worry about, if not wide open borders, any and all comers come on in, but to a porous border, or to simply worrying that while we support immigration, we have a Statue of Liberty, we're a nation of immigrants. I mean, I think we all are. I mean, I think most people would have to acknowledge that. But people that are concerned about the number of immigrants, the number of migrants reaching simply intolerable levels.
Right.
What
I'm asking may be asking a lot. I acknowledge that. But I ask people to take a deep breath and stand back a moment and look at what's happening and ask, why are these folks arriving at the border? I will repeat that we are at an all-time record low in terms of undocumented migration from Mexico. And there's a lot of violence in Mexico as well. But for the vast majority of the country, it may not be heaven, but the economy's okay, that there have been jobs created in Mexico, and most people would rather remain home. The ones that we are concerned with now are from Central America. And if we took a step back, took a deep breath, and tried to put ourselves in their shoes, I think we would understand why they have chosen to take this dangerous trek across Mexico. And then I would ask folks to tap into the humanitarian side of their brain and their soul and ask, how would you want to be treated if you were in their shoes? And I think the answer to that for most people is, give me a chance. Give me a chance to explain my story. And do I need to be in detention to tell the story? And if there's evidence that I'm not going to abscond, then let me tell my story in an atmosphere that assures me some fairness. So I'm not advocating for open borders. I'm advocating more for an open heart, that we treat folks the way we would want to be treated if we were in their shoes.
Well, and related to what you're saying, Bill, too, I mean, I saw an interview recently with the president, I think was the president of El Salvador, who was making the case, I thought pretty honorably, at least based on what I heard him saying. We have to do more here in El Salvador, and of course in Honduras and Guatemala and these other places, to make it so that people don't want to leave. And as a matter of policy, I have to imagine that the resources, the money, the people, the impact on these families and these children has to be weighed against what investment diplomatically, financially, economically, and in other ways we could be making in these countries to help them, helping themselves, and address concerns about immigration that way.
Exactly. If we had another hour, what I'd like to talk about, Aaron, is I just as quickly as I can. Before the worldwide economic meltdown in 2007, 2008, if you look at what the European Union did, when they allowed poor members into the EU, the requirements was first, there was a certain amount of autonomy you had to give up, but also huge investments were made in the immigrant sending nations of Portugal, Spain, Ireland, and that same thing carried through for many of the other poorer countries as well. And it worked up until 2007. When those countries were allowed in, then, and those investments had been made in infrastructure and et cetera, it turns out that the internal migration, which is free within the EU, you can travel from country to country, it was a piddly percentage of people that actually migrated out of those countries. They had been immigrant-sending countries, but they all of a sudden became immigrant-receiving countries. I firmly believe that if we spent the resources that we're spending on the border in helping those countries, that you'd see a big difference, because people really would rather stay home. And again, if we had another hour, we would go back to the history of those countries and the role that the United States played in the economies of those countries. And I think at least some of the people in the audience would feel a little bit differently about our obligation.
Right, a sense of responsibility
to
for
those
sure.
places,
Yeah.
and the folks that we've affected.
Well, I know that you're hinting because you said if we have another hour, and I'm looking at the clock, and I do see we have been talking for an hour. And Bill, it's been so enormously helpful to have this conversation. I hope people will find that they've learned a lot and understand better, and then you can form, honest, value-based views about all of this, but at least with some clarity that I think has really been missing from the debate for a long time. So for that,
well, thank you. It's been my pleasure.
I'm really grateful,
because it has given me an opportunity to expand rather than an 8-second soundbite.
That's what I love about this podcast, and I think this conversation really proves the point. So again, Bill Hing from the University of San Francisco Law School in San Francisco. Thank you very, very much for your time and for helping us through these complex issues. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Take care.